A deal sealed in chains. The boardroom of Kang Enterprises exuded power-polished glass, pristine marble, and a suffocating sense of control. At the head of the long table, Kang Min-ho sat, his expression impassive, though his fingers tightened slightly against the armrest of his leather chair. Across from him, Yoo Hae-jin, the woman he was destined to marry, sat poised, her delicate hands resting on the engagement contract that lay untouched between them. Beside Min-ho, his father Kang Jun-suk watched with quiet authority. "Sign the contract," he ordered. Min-ho's jaw clenched. This was no romantic engagement, it was a merger, a carefully orchestrated alliance between two financial empires. His father had arranged everything since he was a teenager, ensuring that when the time came, he would do his duty. The weight of expectation pressed against him as he picked up the pen. The doors burst open. "I'm sorry." Han Soo-jin stumbled inside, her breath shallow, clutching a thick folder to her chest. Her dark hair was slightly disheveled, and her uniform, a neatly pressed blouse and knee-length skirt, was slightly wrinkled, as if she had sprinted across the office. A sharp silence filled the room. Jun Suk's eyes darkened instantly, his glare enough to send shivers down anyone's spine. "Who is this?" he asked coldly. Soo-jin bowed so quickly that the documents in her arms nearly slipped. "Forgive me, sir. I work under Chief Kang. I was told this report was urgent." Min-ho barely moved, but his sharp gaze landed on her. He recognized her as secretary. He had seen her in passing, always efficient, always quiet, never someone who stepped out of line. Until now, Jun-suk scoffed. "Whatever it is, leave it with an assistant." Soo-jin hesitated. "Two wouldn't have come if it weren't important, sir." Her voice trembled slightly but held firm. Min-ho set the pen down. "Speak." His father's eyes flickered with irritation, but he didn't object. Soo-jin took a deep breath. "There's an error in the projected revenue report. The calculations overestimate earnings by 2.3%. If we proceed with the market announcement as is, it could." Min-ho's gaze sharpened. "It could cause stock fluctuations." She nodded. "Yes, sir." Jun-suk exhaled, unimpressed. "A minor mistake. It can be corrected later." "It will be noticed," Min-ho said simply. He extended a hand, and Soo-jin quickly stepped forward, placing the folder in front of him. For the first time, he truly looked at her. She was unlike the women in his world where they were trained in poise. She was raw, unpolished, yet determined. There was something refreshing about that. Hae-jin, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "She's meticulous. That's valuable." Her tone was neutral, but there was a faint note of curiosity in her eyes. Min-ho flipped through the report. She was right. He tapped a finger against the table before closing the file. "Good work." Soo-jin's lips parted slightly as if she hadn't expected praise. "Thank you, sir." Min-ho met her gaze for just a second longer than necessary. "You may go." She bowed quickly and turned toward the door, her figure disappearing as swiftly as she had entered. But even after she left, something about her presence lingered. Jun-suk scoffed. "A minor distraction. Let's proceed." Min-ho nodded, picking up the pen once more. But as he stared at the contract before him, he hesitated. The unspoken disruption, the clinking of glasses and soft murmurs of conversation filled the grand hall of the Imperial Hotel, one of Seoul's most prestigious venues. An exclusive engagement party was being held in honor of Kang Min-ho and Yoo Hae-jin, an event attended by the country's elite CEOs, politicians, and high-profile investors. Everything was picture perfect. Everything except for the man at the center of it. Min-ho stood near the bar, his fingers loosely wrapped around a glass of whiskey, though he had barely taken a sip. The room felt suffocating, the weight of expectation pressing heavily against him. His engagement was official now, the contract signed earlier that day, yet his mind was far from settled. From across the room, Hae-jin mingled with the guests, effortlessly charming them with her poised elegance. She was good at displaying the role of the perfect fiancée, making small talk that reinforced her position at his side. Yet Min-ho felt no warmth toward her. She was an obligation, not a choice. His father approached, giving him a firm pat on the back. "You've done well today, Min-ho. Everything is proceeding as planned." Min-ho nodded, offering a polite smile, but his thoughts were elsewhere. A memory surfaced, the hesitation he had felt before signing the contract, the way his mind had momentarily wandered to someone else. To her, Han Soo-jin. It was absurd. She was just an employee, someone who had entered his world by accident, not by design. Yet he could still recall the way she had stood her ground, the way she had looked at him, not with admiration or reverence, but with conviction. It was different, unexpected, and it bothered him. Minho? Hi, Jin's voice pulled him back to the present. She was standing beside him now, holding a glass of champagne, her gaze assessing. You look distracted. I'm fine, he replied smoothly, taking a slow sip of whiskey. Jin tilted her head slightly, studying him. She wasn't the type to miss details, and Minho knew she had sensed his slight change in demeanor. You hesitated today, she said, her voice calm yet pointed. Before signing the contract, Minho stiffened for a fraction of a second. It was nothing. Jin smiled, but there was something sharp about it. You're always decisive, but today, it seemed like something crossed your mind. Before he could respond, a familiar voice interrupted. Chief King. Minho turned his head sharply. There she was, Han Soo-jin, standing awkwardly near the entrance, clearly out of place in this world of luxury and high society. She wore a modest black dress, simple compared to the extravagant gowns surrounding her. Her dark eyes flickered with uncertainty, and yet, she was here. His grip on the glass tightened. Why was she here? Jin followed his gaze, raising an eyebrow. Your secretary? Jun-suk, who had also noticed the sudden presence, frowned in disapproval. Who let her in? Soo-jin quickly bowed. I didn't mean to interrupt. The PR team requested my presence to deliver the finalized press release for the engagement announcement. She clutched a small folder to her chest, looking as if she wanted to disappear. A lesser man would have dismissed her immediately, but Minho found himself unable to look away. Jun-suk exhaled impatiently. Someone else could have handled this. There was no need for you to come here personally. Soo-jin nodded quickly. I understand, sir. I only wanted to ensure. It's fine. Minho's voice cut through the tension, his gaze locked onto hers. You've done your job. Stay and have a drink. Soo-jin's eyes widened. What? Even Jin looked mildly surprised, though she masked it well. Jun-suk, however, was not amused. Minho. His voice was laced with warning. Minho met his father's gaze, unflinching. She works for me. She should at least enjoy a drink before she leaves. Jun-suk's disapproval was evident, but he said nothing more, moving on to speak with other guests. Jin, still holding her champagne, glanced between them before giving Soo-jin a small, knowing smile. You must be quite dedicated to your job. Soo-jin shifted uncomfortably. I just wanted to make sure everything was handled properly. Minho could sense her unease, but what intrigued him more was why he was even paying attention. This wasn't normal. He didn't notice people like her. And yet tonight he did. A glimpse of something dangerous. The engagement party continued, a grand spectacle of wealth and power. But Kang Min-ho's attention was elsewhere. He leaned against the bar, his grip firm around the whiskey glass, though he had no real interest in drinking. Across the room, Han Soo-jin stood awkwardly by a tall window, clearly unsure of what to do with herself. She shouldn't be here. And yet, he had told her to stay. Minho wasn't the type to act impulsively. Every decision he made was measured, calculated. Letting her stay had been neither. He watched as a server passed by, offering her a flute of champagne. She hesitated before accepting it, murmuring a quiet thank you. It was obvious that she wasn't accustomed to this kind of setting, the glittering chandeliers, the high-profile guests, the air of expectation that clung to every conversation. And yet, she stood out. Not because of beauty, though, she was certainly not plain, but because there was something unaffected about her. Unlike the polished women in his world, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. It was distracting. Too distracting. Minho exhaled sharply and turned his gaze away, only to find Jin watching him. She lifted her glass, swirling the champagne gently before speaking. You're staring, Minho. His expression didn't waver. I'm observing. A slight smirk touched her lips. Observing what? He didn't answer. Haijin let out a soft laugh. I see. She took a slow sip of her drink before lowering it again. She's not like us. Min Ho's jaw tightened. Haijin continued, her voice measured. She doesn't belong in this world. And yet, for some reason, you let her stay. Why? He didn't have an answer for that. Haijin studied him for a moment, before shaking her head with a small smile. Careful, Minho. Your father doesn't tolerate distractions. Before he could respond, she turned and walked away, seamlessly slipping back into the role of his perfect fiancé. Minho exhaled slowly. This was ridiculous. He was acting out of character. He forced himself to focus on the business associates who approached him, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. He reminded himself of who he was, what his future was set to be. Nothing had changed. And yet, when he glanced toward the window again, Sujin was gone. Outside the hotel, a moment of escape, Sujin stepped outside onto the terrace, exhaling slowly as the crisp night air touched her skin. This world was suffocating. She didn't belong here, and she knew it. The way people looked at her, the way their eyes assessed and dismissed her within seconds, it was exhausting. She hadn't meant to stay this long. She should have left the moment her task was done. But when Kang Min-ho had told her to stay, she had been too stunned to refuse. Why had he said that? She was just an employee, a secretary, someone who lived in the background of his world. There was no reason for him to acknowledge her, much less invite her to stay. Sujin shivered slightly, rubbing her arms. She needed to leave. Cold? The deep voice behind her made her freeze. She turned slowly. Min-ho stood there, hands in his pockets, watching her with the same unreadable expression he always wore. Jin's pulse jumped. Chief Kang? He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming even in the open night air. What are you doing out here? She straightened. Tu was about to leave. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, his gaze flickered toward the city lights in the distance. A silence stretched between them, not exactly uncomfortable, but charged. After a long moment, he spoke. You're different from the people in there. Sujin blinked, caught off guard. I suppose I am. He looked at her then, his sharp eyes searching hers. Why did you come tonight? She swallowed. I told you, it was for work. I didn't expect to stay. His gaze didn't waver. But you did. Sujin exhaled. You told me to. A ghost of a smirk touched his lips. And you always follow orders? She hesitated before answering, then shook her head. Not always. Min-ho's smirk faded, replaced by something else, something dangerous. Sujin suddenly felt breathless, though she wasn't sure why. Before either of them could say another word, a voice interrupted. I should have known I'd find you here. Both turned to see Jun-suk standing at the terrace entrance, his expression dark. Min-ho's face turned to stone. Father. Jun-suk's eyes barely flickered toward Sujin before fixing solely on his son. We need to talk, now. It wasn't a request. Min-ho hesitated for a fraction of a second before giving Sujin one last look. Then, without a word, he turned and followed his father inside. Sujin stood frozen in place, her heart pounding, knowing that something had just shifted between them, and that it was dangerous. A dangerous line. Inside the hotel, the engagement party continued, but Kang Min-ho felt the weight of his father's displeasure like an iron chain. Kang Jun-suk led him into a private lounge, shutting the heavy doors behind them. His sharp gaze locked onto his son. Explain yourself. Min-ho adjusted his cuff, his expression unreadable. There's nothing to explain. Jun-suk's jaw tightened. You let an employee disrupt an event of this magnitude, and worse, you let her stay. Do you have any idea how that looks? Min-ho met his father's gaze without flinching. She was doing her job. Jun-suk scoffed. Don't insult me, you were watching her. A tense silence settled between them. Jun-suk stepped closer. Your engagement to Yoo Hae-jin is the foundation of our future. Your choices reflect on the entire Kang legacy. Min-ho exhaled. Are you worried about reputation or the business deal? Jun-suk's expression was cold. They are one and the same. Min-ho said nothing. Then his father's voice dropped. You will not entertain distractions. If this continues, I will ensure she is removed. A flicker of something dangerous stirred in Min-ho. A warning, a threat. He didn't respond. Because if he died, if he acknowledged Han Soo-jin was important in any way, his father would make her life hell. The next morning, Kang Enterprises. Soo-jin sat stiffly at her desk, hands wrapped around her coffee cup. She had hardly slept. She had spent years blending into the background. But now, she had made a mistake. She had been noticed. And not just by him. June, Suk's look last night had sent chills down her spine. It was a silent warning. A sudden chime from her phone broke her thoughts. Come to my office. Now, her stomach dropped. She didn't need to ask who it was. Taking a steady breath, Soo-jin rose from her desk and walked toward the CEO's office. Kang Min-ho's office. Min-ho stood near the window, his mind troubled. He had spent the morning going through reports, but his thoughts kept drifting back to her. To the way she had looked at him last night, the way she had stood her ground. When the door opened, he didn't turn immediately. Chief Kang, you asked for me? At the sound of her voice, he finally turned. She stood near the door, her posture tense. Min-ho studied her for a moment before speaking. Are you planning to quit? Soo-jin blinked. What? You look nervous, he said, stepping closer. Like you want to disappear. She swallowed. I just didn't expect to be called here so suddenly. Min-ho's gaze didn't waver. You were at the engagement party. You saw my world. Soo-jin hesitated. Yes. He tilted his head. And? She forced herself to meet his gaze. It's not my world. His lips twitched slightly, as if he had expected that answer. No, it isn't. A tense silence stretched between them. Then Min-ho exhaled. Stay away from me. Soo-jin's breath hitched. What? His expression was unreadable. You heard me. Don't draw attention to yourself. Don't make my father notice you again. Soo-jin felt something cold settle in her stomach. Is this a warning? Min-ho's jaw tightened. It's advice. She took a shaky breath. Did I do something wrong? His gaze darkened. Number. That's the problem. Soo-jin felt her pulse quicken. There was something in his voice, something unspoken, something dangerous. Then Min-ho straightened. You can go. She nodded quickly and left, her heartbeat loud in her ears. As the door closed, Min-ho clenched his fists. He had given her a warning. But even as he said the words, he knew. He was already too late. Crossing the line. The warning should have been enough. Kang Min-ho had told Han Soo-jin to stay away, to keep her head down. But as the days passed, he found himself more aware of her presence than ever before. It was a quiet kind of distraction, the worst kind. She never demanded attention, never tried to get close to him, and yet she was always there. At meetings, typing notes with quiet efficiency, passing him reports with steady hands, never lingering, answering his calls with the same neutral professionalism as always. But something had shifted. It was in the way their gazes collided more often than before. The way she would pause for a fraction of a second longer when handing him a file. The way his patience thinned when other men in the office spoke to her, even when it was purely work-related. And worst of all, the way she refused to acknowledge the tension between them. Min-ho had spent his life mastering control. He had built walls so high no one had ever dared to climb them. But she had slipped through the cracks without even trying. And that was dangerous. Very dangerous. That evening, a call that shouldn't have happened. Soo-jin had barely sat down on her small couch when her phone rang. She frowned. It was late. Who would? Her stomach twisted when she saw the name on the screen. Chief Kang. Her fingers hesitated over the screen before she finally answered. Chief, are you home? His voice was deep, steady, but there was something else beneath it. Soo-jin sat up straighter. Yes. Did something happen? A pause. Then, his next words sent a shiver down her spine. I shouldn't be calling you. Soo-jin's breath caught in her throat. Then why did you? Another silence. Then, softer this time, I don't know. The line went dead. Soo-jin stared at her phone, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was bad. Very, very bad. The next day, an uninvited guest. Min-ho was drowning in paperwork. when his office door swung open. He didn't even need to look up. "Father," he greeted flatly. Jun-suk walked in with measured steps, his presence alone commanding attention. He sat down without an invitation, his expression unreadable. Min-ho leaned back, bracing himself. "What is it this time?" Jun-suk exhaled, watching him closely. "You've been distracted." Min-ho's grip on his pen tightened slightly. "I don't know what you mean." His father's lips curled into a cold smile. "Oh, I think you do." Silence. Then, Jun-suk placed a folder onto Min-ho's desk and slid it forward. Min-ho frowned, but opened it. The moment his eyes landed on the contents, his blood ran cold. Inside were photographs. Photographs of Han Soo-jin, leaving her apartment, entering the office, sitting at a cafe. Even that brief moment when she had paused near his car. Min-ho's pulse pounded in his ears. Jun-suk tilted his head slightly. "It seems she's become an interest of yours." Min-ho shut the folder slowly, forcing his voice to remain steady. "You had her followed." His father's expression didn't change. "Of course." Min-ho clenched his jaw. "Why?" Jun-suk leaned forward slightly. "Because I want to remind you of something very simple, Min-ho. This," he gestured toward the folder, "is a weakness, and you are not allowed to have weaknesses." A deadly silence filled the room. Jun-suk's voice was calm, but every word was a threat. "Your engagement to Yoo Hae-jin is set. Your future is secure. I won't let you jeopardize everything over a mere employee." Min-ho's fingers curled into fists beneath the desk. Jun-suk rose from his seat, adjusting his cufflinks. "Handle this, Min-ho, or I will." And with that, he left. Min-ho remained seated, staring at the closed folder. Something inside him snapped. That night, a reckless decision. Soo-jin had just stepped out of her apartment building when a sleek black car pulled up in front of her, the window lowered. Kang Min-ho was behind the wheel. Soo-jin's heart leaped into her throat. "Chief Kang?" He didn't say a word. He simply reached over and opened the passenger door. Soo-jin hesitated. Everything in her screamed that this was a mistake, that stepping into that car meant stepping over a line she could never return from. But then she looked at him, at the tension in his jaw. The way his grip on the steering wheel was just a little too tight. And against every rational thought she got in, the door shut with a soft click. Min-ho pulled away from the curb, his knuckles white. Soo-jin swallowed. "Where are we going?" Min-ho's eyes remained fixed on the road. Then finally he spoke. "Somewhere my father can't reach." No turning back. The city lights blurred past as Kang Min-ho drove, his grip tight around the steering wheel. In the passenger seat, Han Soo-jin sat stiffly, her hands resting in her lap. She should have refused. She should not be here. But she was. Because when he had looked at her, when he had said those words, "Somewhere my father can't reach," she had known. Something had changed, and there was no undoing it now. A place without eyes. Min-ho pulled into a secluded house outside Seoul. Soo-jin hesitated. "Why did you bring me here?" Min-ho leaned against the car. "Because I needed to think." Soo-jin swallowed. "And you needed me here for that?" A long silence. Then finally, yes. Her heart pounded. This was reckless. But standing here, beneath the dim glow of the porch light, it didn't feel like a mistake. Not yet. Min-ho took a slow breath. "I've spent my life following orders." Soo-jin's fingers tightened. "And now?" His lips pressed into a thin line. "Now, I don't know anymore." She exhaled shakily. "You're engaged." Min-ho's gaze darkened. "Say my name." Soo-jin hesitated. "I can't." "Why?" "Because if I do, I won't be able to stop myself from crossing the line." Min-ho stepped closer. "Then don't stop." The air crackled between them. Soo-jin whispered Min-ho. And just like that, the line shattered. The consequence. The next morning, Min-ho sat at the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. Everything had changed. Reality would come for them soon. And when it did, there would be no mercy. The price of weakness. When Min-ho arrived at the office, his father was waiting. Jun-suk sat behind the CEO's desk flipping through documents. Min-ho shut the door. "What do you want?" Jun-suk slid a folder toward him. Inside were photographs. Photographs of Han Soo-jin. Min Ho's pulse pounded. Jun-suk's voice was calm but firm. End it. Now. A deadly silence filled the room. Min Ho's hands curled into fists beneath the desk. Jun-suk smirked. Or I will. The breaking point. Soo-jin barely had time to process Min Ho's message before he arrived at her apartment. She opened the door, heart hammering. Min! His expression stopped her cold. He looked different, distant, cold. His voice was sharp. We're done. Soo-jin's stomach dropped. What? This was a mistake, he said flatly. It's over. Her breath hitched. You don't mean that. His jaw tightened. Yes, I do. He turned to leave. Soo-jin whispered, So that's it? You tell me to stay, to call you by your name, and now you throw me away? Min Ho hesitated, but he didn't look back. Forget this ever happened. The door shut behind him. And for the first time, Soo-jin realized loving Kang Min Ho would only end in heartbreak. 1 month later, the wedding approaches. The engagement between Kang Min Ho and Yoo Hae-jin was now the talk of every business column. And Soo-jin? She had resigned. No goodbyes, no explanations. She had disappeared from his world. At least, that was what everyone thought. But on the night of the engagement gala, as Min Ho stood beside his future wife, a familiar presence caught his eye. Soo-jin. Standing at the back of the room, her expression unreadable. She had come, and for the first time in a month, Min Ho felt his carefully controlled world start to crack again.